Good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem. Fill your plates, get comfortable, have a seat. We're looking forward to an exciting presentation from Rabbi Shon Shlita, the Bezdin of Bezdin, South Florida. My name is Eliezer Goldschmidt. I'm a rabbi of the nearby neighborhood of Hollywood Hills. I don't know if you've heard of it or not. And I have the schos of being part of the T4 Biz Halacha initiative, where myself, among other rabbanim, had the schos of learning Chayshim Mishma in the afternoons in North Miami Beach Kollel. And there's really, besides Rabbi Shon, which I'm going to introduce in a moment, there are two parties that we have to thank. Sorry, three. First, place to play that Sunday. Thank you to Terry Smith for hosting the event. It's amazing to see the wonderful things that you built here, and should go and continue to go back and There are two parties that require mentioning. Number one is that the dream of bringing awareness to Chayshim Mishpat and showing the world, the business world in particular, that there are halachas and that Hashem actually has something to say about the business world. But more importantly, it's not about creating problems, it's about creating awareness and showing you that there are solutions. It's about guiding you in the right directions, that the Rabbanim and the Dayanim, who are educating Chayshim Mishpat, are there to help. And we have ways of helping to structure and moralize anything to be done appropriately, al-pi halacha and Chayshim Mishpat, the way it should be done. This dream ultimately was fulfilled with the initiative of the Stockton law firm, who brought this to attention and was able to pair up with the North Miami Beach Kollel to have Rabbanim learn Chayshim Mishpat, be able to create initiatives and spread it from there. So we have a tremendous thank you for them for bringing this as a reality. And I have to say that working with a law firm that is sensitive to halachic sensitivities is a complete game changer. And I highly recommend that anyone who has any serious implications and wants to make sure that it's not the halacha should refer to them. The second party that we have to thank is, never likes it when I mention it, so I won't look, Rav Yossi Shuk and the Bernat and Rosenberg team for allowing this dream to spread into Hollywood. Baruch Hashem, South Florida is a large place, and there was a need to be filled to bring it to the larger South Florida community. They stepped in. He saw it as a vision of something to spreading Torah, building Torah, giving people the opportunity to learn about Chayshim Mishpat. And as I mentioned before, it's been a tremendous pleasure to work with him and with the entire team. And like I mentioned, it's mamash a game-changing experience when you deal with people that, besides the tremendous professional expertise that they have, to have halachic sensitivity is an unbelievable thing. So thank you again to those. Lastly, I would like to introduce Rabbi Shon, the Av Bezdin of Bezdin, South Florida, who has dedicated much of his life to Chayshim Mishpat, almost bringing it back in style a little bit. And Al Kopanim, we have the schos of hearing his words and sharing with the topic of tonight. Please come join us.
This is being recorded. Interesting. Okay, so we may have to. I don't mind clipping, but we may, sometimes I say things I don't necessarily want to be recorded. Everybody today thinks, right? Everybody thinks today everything that's being said is significant enough that they want to share it with the world. So we'll see. Thank you very much. Just as a small plug. I came here about 16 years ago. We're resurrecting it now, the Chayshim Mishpat Kollel, and we're part of the Business Halacha Institute. Almost sounds like the Business Halacha Initiative, except the Business Halacha Institute has been around a long time, and the true pioneer, really, for all of this reawakening, for lack of a better word, is Rav Chaim Cohen, who I learned under for Dayanis, and he was the pioneer. And Baruch Hashem, it's really wonderful. The more people that pick it up and spread it, it's only a good thing. For Klal Yisrael, we need to be very particular about how we behave. And unfortunately, even though I would be sure, I am sure that as a nation, as a people, that we are well better behaved, but unfortunately a lot of times in the headlines, certain things come up, and I always am afraid to look at the surname. So Baruch Hashem, going and learning these things will, unless somebody is psychopath, they're not going to be able to learn these things and act in a different way. So just to get started, I first of all, shkayach to everybody, to the law firms, and my good friend Rabbi Smith. As a parenthetical thing, I've been Zayich in the last 3 years to give a lot of shirim in South Africa, and I met Rabbi Smith's uncle, who it looks like it's a family clone of some sort. They all look the same, and in a good way, and they have the same personalities. His uncle's got a tremendous kehila of I think 400 or 500 people in Joburg. So you see the same. It must be a familial thing. It's built into the genes, Baruch Hashem, to build kehilas and only continue to hatzlacha in this regard. Just as a side point, also I think a good way for people to envision themselves in order to ensure proper behavior. Obviously, learning the halachas are paramount. But just as a side idea, a few weeks ago we had the pasuk, "Bechor bincha titein li." Rosh Baruch Hu says, "Give me your bechor." Rashi and the Rambam say, "Behei sloim," that it's referring to Pidyon haben. The problem is, it doesn't make any sense. Bechor bincha titein li means HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "Give me your bechor for service." Pidyon haben is to extricate him from service. That's the simple understanding of it. Without getting into a whole lengthy discussion because we don't have time, I had other rise to this. It means not that you're being redeemed from service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, rather you're being redeemed into a different venue of servicing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One of the problems is a lot of times people, after they're finished their yeshiva life, so to speak, or when they leave, they think that they're in a different world. And I'll tell you what I told my oldest son when he went to law school after Koilel. I said, don't be a balavasa, learn to be a ben Torah that works. It's a big difference. When you maintain that surah of being a ben Torah, it gives tremendous assistance to how you act. And frankly, without getting into a lot of detail, it's part of your avodas Hashem. The Ma'or Einayim in Parshas Nesavim says that when you have the right kavanas, let's say you're renting a house, and at the time you think about the halachas of Sfiras Batim, you are actually physically the actualizer of those abstract concepts in this world. You're bringing physicality. You are the conduit. So when you do these things, it is part of your avodas Hashem. And it's a long discussion and for another time, but there's something to keep in mind. Okay. So the topic tonight is competition, and it is an area that is a very emotional area. We've had numerous dinei Torah, and as you can well imagine, many times people are quite animated, to put it mildly, when it comes to these situations. So let's first understand hashkafically, how are we supposed to view all of this? So the Chazon Ish first of all points out that we have no clue how to act if we're going to rely on our emotions and sense of fairness. And he gives a good example. We will Mr. Shem cover it shortly. There's a Gemara when it comes to competition, that when it comes to rebbes and yeshivas and things of that nature, you can't stop somebody because kinas seifrim tar b'chachma, that the competition and learning only enhances the wisdom of the Talmidei Chachamim. So you imagine for a moment, if you didn't see that Gemara, right? You imagine you have an old Rav, an old Rebbe, he's been teaching people for years, and all of a sudden a young whippersnapper, fresh out of Koilel, charismatic, shows up in town and starts giving shiurim. Not that he's poaching the other people, but they hear about it, and they start to leave from the old Rav and they start to learn by him. And of course the old Rav is incensed. He says, look, you're taking away from my parnas. I've been here for 50 years. Who do you think you are? If we would just analyze the situation from our own sense of fairness, we would assume that the old Rav is right. No, the Gemara says, Kina Seifrim Tar B'Chachma. That's the reality that the Torah created. Once that's the reality, it's the old Rav that's going to be wrong if he pursues the young Rav. That's number one. Number two, the Chazon Ish says something very, very important. He says, you're making a terrible mistake. If you think that if somebody sets up competition, he's going to diminish from your income, that really is kfirah. Because every Rosh Hashanah, Kadosh Baruch Hu, determines what your parnas is going to be for that year. And so what does it mean? It means if the halacha affords you the right to try to stop somebody and you want to go to Bez, then that becomes part of your hishtadlus to make parnasa. It means it becomes part of your responsibility. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do it. Being mevater is a much higher level, But that's what it is. It's part of your efforts to sustain parnasa. But it's not because that he's actually going to be diminishing your parnasa. So if we understand that, then it would help us a little bit. Okay. So essentially there are 4 categories when it comes to competition. One is known as Oni Mahapech B'Charora, which literally translates as a poor person trying to go after a biscuit. I know it sounds kind of pedestrian. We'll get to what that means in a minute, Bez Hashem. But really, in essence, it means interference. We'll explain the parameters, Bez Hashem, shortly. That's number 1. Number 2 is what we call Yarid L'Umnas Chavera, which is commonly known as Masig Gevul, right? That you're competing with somebody. You're setting up a competing business. Right? Masig Gevul doesn't really mean that. Masig Gevul means in Eretz Yisrael, if you want to increase your lot size, when your neighbor goes on vacation, you move the wall more in this direction. That's Masig Gevul. But we use it because obviously it sounds like the same thing. It's you're encroaching on somebody's business. That's category number 2. Third category is marufia, which according to many is an Arabic word. We'll get maybe into the etymology when we cover it shortly. Again, there is limited time here, so we'll do the best I can. I don't want to sacrifice depth for breadth, so I'll do the best I can. We may not be able to cover all of them sufficiently. But marufia means a guy has a client, he's a lawyer, he has a client for many years, year in, year out, and he has every reasonable expectation to maintain that relationship, and you come and try to take it away. That's called marufia. The last category is Ani Menakef B'Rosh Hazayis. And that really simply translates, not the words, but the category is capitalizing on someone else's efforts, right? The Gemara discussed a case. It's a poor fellow. He climbs up an olive tree. And incidentally, olive trees grow very high, believe it or not. And he's putting himself in peril. And he's shaking the tree that the olives should fall off. Again, he never made a kinyan. The olives fall to the ground. And another guy walks by and says, shkoyach, thank you very much. Takes the olives and moves on. Okay? That's category number 4. So let's start with Ani Mahapech B'Charor. We have a Gemara. It's a Gemara Kedushin. And it talks about 2 people that are engaged in some type of deal. And they've consummated the deal only in the sense they've agreed on the pricing and the terms, but it still lacks a kinyan. All right, in halacha, you need to have a kinyan, some form of a mode of acquisition or conveyance to complete a transaction. Okay, just parenthetically, you should understand, the Chazon Ish says it this way, a kinyan, generally what it is, its purpose is to signify concretization and finalization of thoughts. People have fleeting thoughts. When you do a physical act, it's demonstrative of the fact that now you've made up your mind unequivocally. So in halacha, we'll see the flip side of this. If somebody gives a word, you should keep your word. But it is not actionable in Bezdin. If there's a kinyan, then that's a different story. And by the way, let me just point out, we will see that in most of these cases here, it's not really actionable in Bezdin. You need to understand something very fundamental to Torah law when it comes to business, unlike, conversely, secular law. And that is, you may go to Bezdin, and Bezdin may not be able to extract money from you or force you to pay or whatever it is. It's not actionable. It doesn't mean that what you did was morally suitable. It could be that it's egregious. It could be morally egregious, yet it's not actionable in Bezdin. So you don't get shlishi or shishi, depending on what shul you're davening at afterward. You're not at tzaddik, even though Bezdin couldn't do it. There's various reasons for this. There's one important principle in halacha called kimli. In Jewish law, if you have, and as you well know, in most areas you have disagreements, machlokes, and these complicated principles. But if you have a machlokes, the person that's muhsik, the person that's in possessive state, theoretically could say, kimli, I hold like the position that favors my argument. And as a matter of fact, in 2 different dinei Torah, you could say kimli using one side and then the other. Now, we have a system, practically all of Bati Dinim in the world use a system of Pshar Karev Ladin. Pshar doesn't mean just wanton compromise. That would be ridiculous too. It means we have a machlokes, we relax the standards and don't allow kimli necessarily. Okay, but because of that, it is harder to extract money, and that's something that is to be considered into the backdrop to all of this. Okay? So, Ani Mahak B'Charara, two people are engaged in a discussion, they finalized all the terms, and now all that's lacking is a kinyan. And the Gemara discusses a case where one of the Amoraim was buying, I think it was Rav Gidol, right, was buying a property, and another Rav came along and purchased the property. And I think it was Rav Gidol was incensed. What's going on over here? So they said, wait till he comes up, and we'll discuss it with him. So they asked him, Oni Mahaktu Charara, right? Somebody that interferes in a business. What's the din? He says, it's a Russia. Yeah, he's a Russia. So why did you do what you did? He said, I had no idea he wanted to buy the property. And the Gemara ends, he wanted to give it as a gift. So he didn't want to sell it because he felt there was a thing that is bad mazel. So interesting, the Gemara says bad mazel to sell the first property that you buy. Something interesting to note. But he said, okay, but I'll give it to him as a gift. And the other side didn't want to take it because he says, soina matanas yicheh. You don't want to take gifts. That's a higher level, a higher madriga. So they let the field remain fallow, and they called it Ar Darabon, and the people used it, the young Talmidei Chachamim, but that's the story in the Gemara. Okay, so again, when you have a verbal commitment, lacking a kinyan, either side could theoretically retract, but if you come in and interfere, that's called Ani Mahapich B'Charara, and you are considered to be a Rasha, which I hope will bother most people in here. And just by the way, you should know what the procedure used to be. This is a good idea for you if you want to fill up the shul. I'm sure that you are anyhow, right? That what they used to do is if they determined somebody was a Russia in this case, they would wait till Kriyas Torah and they would get up in shul and say so-and-so is a Russia. Now, if you would make an announcement that this Shabbos, one of the congregants are going to be called a Russia in public, I assure you, it will be standing room only. So it's not a small thing. Now, we have a very big machlokes, Rishonim, when is it Ani Mahapech B'Charara? It's not necessarily in all instances. Rashi holds in all instances, one may not interfere with the transaction. Period. End of story. But Rabbeinu Tam comes along, and Rabbeinu Tam says, no, it's not in all circumstances. If something is what we call a mitzvah, again, we'll get into what he means by that, but let's, for our purposes now, call it literally a mitzvah, a lost item that it doesn't belong to anybody, or a hefker, there you do not apply the concept of Ani Mahapech B'Charara. Why? Why is that? So the Mordechai was something should explain that it could very well be along the lines of Bar Metzra. Bar Metzra is a law where you have, this comes up, we've had a few cases, somebody is selling their property and the person who lives adjacent to the property has priority. If he wants to combine the lots, if it's simply for an investment, not. But that's only in the case where property can be acquired elsewhere, because he could say to the guy, why are you buying the field next to me? I have economies of scale. Go somewhere else. But if you can't find it somewhere else, so you have, again, Bar Metzvah is Lifnim Mishur Sadin. It's a midah. It's a Lifnim Mishur Sadin that Chazal legislated to become halacha. So the same thing applies over here. That's the logic. Rabbeinu Tam saying if it's a mitzvah hefker, you can't find a mitzvah any day of the week. So the guy has no right to say go find a mitzvah somewhere else, and therefore he holds you're not called a Russia by Ani Mahapech B'Charara if it's a mitzvah or hefker. Okay. When you get to the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Reish Lamed Zayin, the Mechaber, for those Sephardim in here, Paskins like Rashi. Okay? We'll come back to that, Bez Hashem. So that means the Mechaber rules that in all circumstances, even Mitzi and Hefker, one may not interfere with the deal that's been consummated exclusive, of course, of the kingdom. Now there's a separate machlokes. How expansive is the ruling of Rabbeinu Tam? Because he says Mitzi and Hefker. The Mardach says it literally means Mitzia or Hefker. That's what it literally means. But that's the Ramban. The Mardach rules, no, it means what we call a Mitzia. Anything that's a good deal that can't be replicated elsewhere, that is also not a din of Ani Mahapech B'Charara. And the Ramah seems to rule like the more expansive ruling, which means, at least for Ashkenazim, right? Anything that is something that can't be replicated elsewhere, the laws of Ani Mahapech do not apply. Now, in the second sif in Reish Lamed Zayin, the Mechaber brings a din that if somebody has a fantastic malamed, in the old days, people would bring a malamed into their house to teach their children, right? It wasn't, schools were not widespread. And this guy is supposed to be unbelievable. So he has a right, he says a person can go and try to get, after the contract is over, he has a right to go after the guy, even though it seems like they would continue. So the Nesivis wants to say, you see that the Mechaber really clarified his position in the second thing, and maybe he really paskins like Rabbeinu Tam. But both the Chasam Sofer and Aruch HaShulchan ruled no. That Torah is a different thing. Limud Torah is a different thing. The Mechaber is not retracting from his position to be Machmer. I just was back in my former hometown, Los Angeles, a few months ago. My good friend Rabbi Lebar is a well-known Moroccan Pesach. He just put out on Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat a lot of the psakim of the Gedolei Sfarad, and it's very clear that they all seem to hold the Mechaber is strict and paskins like Rashi. Okay, so this is number one. Number one is that a person, in some circumstances, cannot interfere with the deal, even though it's lacking a kinyan. So let me tell you the flip side of this, and I'll give you a shot that I had to kind of hammer the point home. The flip side to this coin really is, if somebody gives their word to somebody, and let's say I'm going to give you a matana, I'm going to give you a gift, right? Or they make an agreement, verbal agreement, without a kinyan. A person cannot be forced to uphold his word. He should uphold his word. That's the morally correct behavior. But if he retracts, Bezin can't stop it. Although he is called b'chusar amana, he's deemed to be deficient in trustworthiness. Now, that is only though when there is what we call smichas das. There's a reasonable expectation that the guy is expecting the deal to go through. But if it's matana meruba, for example, he says, I'm going to give you a yacht, unless he's, Bill Gates, right? You're not going to really deep down believe, you have no real smichas das that the gift is going to go through. There would not be b'chusar amana, unless initially he had no intention of doing it. There's a separate issue if there was substantial change to the situation. So that's a machlokes in Siman Reish Daled, whether somebody that retracts what they call trade tari, there was a major dislocation in the market, or there was a material change in the whole situation. Some say then that's not called b'chusar amana, and some say the Ramah says though, but you should be machmer even in such a case. So here's a shayla that came to me, and we'll play it on both sides of the equation. I got a call from the Midwest. I'm not sure why I got the call from the Midwest. They have great poskim out there. But in any event, the fellow was selling his house. Again, I don't know why people live in Chicago. It's flat like here, and it's freezing cold in the winter. But no offense, I have good friends and relatives there. In any event, he had 3 people look at the house, and nothing happened, so he hired a broker. Now the broker, but he exempted, he told the broker, look, I have 3 people that have already looked at the house. They are not included in this arrangement, which is standard procedure. And lo and behold, one of the guys that had seen it outside of the broker decided that they want to buy the house, and they came to a price agreement, and the fellow didn't sign a contract, but he sent something over for the perusal of the buyer. Literally, I think a day later, maybe even less than that, he gets a call from the broker. She has a bid, and even with the commission that was included, it was still a substantially higher price than what he was offered. So he called me up to ask, is he obligated to follow through? So I said like this. I said, number one, the Aruch HaShulchan says when the Ramah says you have to be makar by trade tari with a serious difference in price, that's midas chasidus. I can't tell you to be a chassid. It's a good thing, but I can't be frum with your money. That's number one. And number two, as I said, more importantly, I don't think there was a real smichas das. Anybody that has any vague understanding of the real estate market, right, knows that the fact that even if something gets signed and goes into escrow, many times, especially in commercial properties and industrial properties, it doesn't go anywhere, okay? So the question is, of course, if a contract is signed, that might constitute a kinyan, and constitute that's a different story. But here, at this juncture, there's no real smichas das. There's no real reliance. So I felt that he could retract based on that, because it was a very short period of time, and there was no reliance. And the same thing would apply in the inverse. The broker that's pursuing the sale, is she violating ani mahapich b'charora? Because they had a deal, and it's lacking the kinyan. And I felt also that was the same thing would apply with there was no real reliance. Because we all know, first of all, aside from just the price, there's many terms that have to be worked out. When it goes hard, what the inspection, all these things, none of that was addressed. So there's so many things that there was no real smichas das. That's how it came out. Okay, so that gives you a little example on ani mahapich b'charora. Any questions on this part? Wow, either doing a great job or a terrible job. Okay, fine. Huh? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, we had cases. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. No. Ma'aser Shabuchoim. We'll get into that more in competition. Okay. So the second category is Yared Lumnes Chaveroi or Basik Vul, which is people quote all day long. That means opening up a competing business. Okay. So this is really primarily Gemara in Bava Basra, Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, and there's a discussion over there about can one stop somebody from engaging in a competing business in their neighborhood. And the Gemara discusses different categories of people. One is a Bar Basra, Achrise, right, that somebody that lives in a different town and doesn't pay the local taxes. And one is somebody that lives, remember, any of you that learned Erevin or all these Gemaras in the old days, and even today in Eretz Yisrael to a large degree, they had bavois, they had common alleyways, and then they had chatzerim, they had courtyards. So it's a big discussion in the Gemara, and it's a machlekes between Rav Huna and Rav Huna Berei the Rav Yeshua. Rav Huna says everybody agrees you can stop somebody from out of town if he doesn't pay the tax. We'll get into that, Bez Hashem. And the machlokes is in your own mavoi. Can somebody stop their neighbor from opening up? Rav Huna Berei the Yeshua says you cannot, and Rav Huna says that you could. Okay, so just let's take a step back and try to understand the whole backdrop to this. First of all, I did this shir on headlines about 4 or 5 months ago, and the person that was running the program, a good friend of mine, he asked me, is it that Rav Huna is less pro-competition and Rav Huna Berei Yeshua is more pro-competition? So I said I'm loath to qualify, calling one a Republican and one a Democrat. That's not how things work. So what is this all about? So let's take a step back and first of all understand where this all begins. Why should anybody have a right to stop anybody? Now, you'll find many times when you're learning Choshen Mishpat, it's a tshuva or two that really opens up the whole sugya. And in this case, the Chassam Sofer wrote the landmark tshuva, in my humble opinion, in Siman Ayin Tes and Choshen Mishpat. And he first starts off to discuss what is this whole structure? What does this all mean? Now, in Shulchan Aruch, it's all in Hilchos Shchenim. Hilchos Shchenim are the laws about you opening up windows in someone's courtyard, many different halachas about tashmid, what a neighbor can stop you from doing that is affecting his property and such. And we paskin like Rav Yossi. The starting point is in my property I can do whatever I want, except if it's gira delay. Literally, that means shooting arrows into someone's property. So it doesn't literally mean necessarily that, but anything that has a direct impact, negative impact on somebody's property, even though you're doing it in your property, could be stopped. According to Rav Yossi, it could be that I'm suggesting the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Yeshua is, because some say gira delay means it has to be an immediate causative effect. And some say no, even could be what we call like garmi, where there's some dislocation between the act and the result. Okay, so it could be that Rav Huna holds it needs to be. I'm saying even if it's not immediate, it's still problematic. And Rav Huna says no, it has to be immediate. So machlekes probably is in gira delay. Anyhow, back to the Chassam Sofer. He wants to explain where does it derive from. So most people, if they read the tshuva, he cryptically refers to a tshuva he wrote on Kaddish. I know it sounds odd, but I'm a Yekka, and I was well aware of what he's talking about. So let me introduce you to something that probably most of you don't know. The halacha is that when someone lo yaleinu has to say Kaddish, only one person says Kaddish at a time. What you think to be in the Mishnah Berurah, where they're discussing the chalukim, right? Who davens? Everybody thinks it's who davens for the yomid. It's not who davens for the yomid. It's who gets to say the Kaddish. So all the priorities, yard side versus shiva versus shloshim, all refers to that. Only one person. If you go, for example, to the German shul in Zurich or in Breuer's, they take turns. One guy goes up, puts on a talus, says Kaddish, moves back. Another guy comes up, and it's only one person. As a matter of fact, there was a tshuva written to the Chassam Sofer from Rav Shlomo Kluger years ago, something that sounds almost unnatural. There was a bunch of shuls in his town, and they all united to make one big shul. I don't ever hear in history something like that happened, but it did. But as a consequence of that, it mitigated the amount of Kaddishim that were available and created havoc in the shul. And so they asked Chassam Sofer whether they can increase the amount of Kaddishim or let one or more people say it. He refused. Okay. The one exception, by the way, just parenthetically, is a historical note. The first mention of more than one person saying Kaddish is Rav Yaakov Emden in his Sefer Beis Yaakov, where he lived in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam was primarily Sephardim. And he said the Sephardim say Kaddish together, but they know how to synchronize. You understand? No, it's true. You go to an Ashkenazi shul, one guy's halfway through, this guy's saying Tiskabel, this guy's saying Yeheshmei Rabbah, they're never together. I make a sport out of it sometimes. So it's good stamazah that everybody should get together when they're. Anyhow, the Maril asks the question, that one of the questions in Kaddish is, does a resident have a right to push away a visitor? Okay? And the Maril, one of the great early, or somewhat later, either early Ach or late Rishon, not sure how we would categorize him, he explains what this is all about. Why should a resident have the rights versus somebody visiting? So he brings two sources. I'll only mention you one. In the old days, we didn't have to be nice, Rabbi Smith, to get money for the kehillah. They would show up in the guy's house and they say, Shloimeh, we see you made a lot of money this year. Here's how much you made. And Shkoyach, you're giving X amount to the kehillah. And if he didn't agree, they would extract some of his assets to ensure collection. Matter of fact, in some communities, I think even in Zurich, if you don't pay up, you don't get buried. It's not a simple matter. Anyhow, says the Maril, because you have achrayas, there's commensurate rights that you get as well. So if you're in a neighborhood, because you have a responsibility and can be implored upon to make payments to support the community, you also have commensurate rights. And so the Chassam Sofer says that's the same thing over here, right? When it comes to competition, a resident has the rights because he's a resident. They're under the rubric, as you guys like to say, of Hilchos Shchenim. Okay? So now, coming back to the matter at hand. If you read the Gemara, and you read the Shulchan Aruch, by and large, we pass on Rav Huna Berei, the Rav Yeshua, which means can't stop anybody, except for somebody from out of town that doesn't pay the local taxes. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. Like I said earlier, a Rebbe, Mikra Dardaki, right, you can't stop him. Even a Rav Huna would hold you can't stop him because Kina Sefrim Tabra Chachma. The Gemara gives 6 or 7 different examples where there's an exception to the rule. But by and large, if we just learned the Gemara, we can go home and say you can't stop anybody. And more than that, by the way, as you start to peel away at everything based on the current economic structures that we have today, which are fundamentally different, clearly, than the times of the Gemara. I mean, even in our lifetime, things have changed radically, right? You still remember the dial phones now, right? The internet, everything's changed. And it's exponential, incidentally, in what's happening. So, really don't have these type of structure. We have a mavoi or this or that, a bar mosach we see. It's hard to say that somebody's really from out of town. You have Uber Eats, you have all kinds of things that people are competing. The world really is, as the Marshdam says, and sometimes what he calls an irprutza. I don't mean that in a negative spiritual way. It means prutza means it's opened up, there's no movoi, people are transacting through the whole city, and it could very well be that it doesn't even exist today. And what is the cargo? What is the tax? So there's a big discussion. One person told me the shul dues, which I find hard to believe since, first of all, many people don't pay dues. But besides that, it's probably the municipal taxes that are paid. And anybody that sets up a business, in theory, right, is obligated to pay those taxes so that they would qualify in any event. So there's a few things going on. There's no mavais anymore. There's not really other cities. It's very hard to find any situation, really, where, so far, in the reading of the Gemara, you could stop somebody. Except, and here's where the fun begins. There is a Mordechai that brings an Avi Yosef. And the Avi Yosef says the following thing. He says, if somebody has a mill in a mavoi, imagine, right, he's way in the back, not a mavoi with full of shit, so let's say it's a giant, it's closed off. You have one entrance, and he's all the way in the back, and he has his mill for many, many years, and a new guy comes in, and he opens up his mill at the entrance to the mavoi, right? And that means essentially, no one's going to venture past this fellow. In such a case, he says you can stop the fellow. He says Kiddur Rav Huna. So here's where it gets a little bit tricky because we don't pass Rav Huna. And consequently, since he said Kiddur Rav Huna, the Beis Yosef and the Mechaber and even the Ramah doesn't bring it down. Nobody seems to bring this Avi Yosef la halacha. It's not a simple matter. The Chasam Sofer paskins the Avi Yosef. We'll come back to that, Be'ez Hashem. And some paskin the Avi Yosef, but it's not entirely clear. Some say he means that it's like Rav Huna, means the halacha is like Rav Huna in this particular case. So, we're left with the classic pizza shop example. If we use the Avi Yosef, so let's say you're in a small town. If we can only imagine this, it's hard for us to have only one restaurant, only one pizza shop, right? No sushi, just pizza, right? And by the way, you'll only find in the Jewish world. I challenge you to find any Goyish restaurant that has sushi together with pizza. It's only Klal Yisrael. I think we eat more per capita than Japanese people. But B'chol Mikra, if you apply the Avi Yosef, depending on how you apply it, it could come out that if a guy has a pizza shop and somebody wants to open up another pizza shop, that if the city can't sustain both, maybe you would apply the Avi Yosef and stop the second fellow. Now, most poskim don't paskin the Avi Yosef. The Divrei Chaim, the great Heilige San Zarov, didn't paskin it. As a result, most Batei Dinim don't paskin the Avi Yosef. It's very, very hard to stop somebody. It does happen. Back in my old home state, in San Diego, I lived in LA, but in San Diego it's still governed by the RCC, which covers all of California. There was a pizza shop, and the Bezin was going to shut down the new one coming on. They were going to invoke the Avi Yosef. But the first guy was doing renovations, so he lost his chazaka. But they were going to do it. Now, we've had cases, and I'm not going to say exactly, it's not a simple matter. So let me give you an example of how some of the places can treat it. First of all, Chasam Sofer vociferously rules the Avi Yosef, and he has a huge chiddush. He says there is no machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Huna Berei Rav Yeshua. For Haraya, what's the Raya? Why, if Rav Huna is not a Liba the Hilchasa, if he's not the Halacha, why is the Gemara even bother with talking about exceptions to Rav Huna afterwards? So he says they're talking about two completely different circumstances. One is what we call pasik chiyusa, a diminishment of someone's parnasa, and on that you can't stop somebody. But then there's what we call pasik chiyusa legamri, where you obliterate someone's parnasa, and that is the Avi Yosef. So he paskins Avi Yosef la halacha. Okay? Now, it's a very long tshuva. There's many things that we're not going to have time to this. By the way, wow. When am I supposed to finish? 11:30, was it? Okay. Would you give me 1 second before, and then I'll okay. So in any event, it's very hard to stop somebody, but I will give you an example. And here, who's recording this? Everyone. No, okay. This is where we might. want to edit it. I'll tell you a case that I had. Just to, I'm sorry, let me go back to Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe had a few cases. One case was, there was a Meichus Svarim, there was a Judaica store, and now a second fellow wanted to come and open up a new one. So they came before Rav Moshe Zatzal, and he has a fascinating ruling. He's told the first guy, I'll stop the second guy, provided you have to pay him for all of his build-outs, and you have to take on his lease. So it seems to me, maybe I'm reading Rav Moshe wrong, but it seems to me he was using the Avi Yosef. You know, it's interesting he didn't mention Avi Yosef, because he says he determined that the city can't sustain 2 Judaic stores, but it seems like he didn't want to be Moitzi Momen. He didn't want to cause a loss. So the first guy would have to help the second guy if he wants to stop him. That's how Rav Moshe came out. So he did utilize it. We do see some poskim that utilize it, but it's rarer, and sometimes it will be done. If again, there's another element to this too. If something is insidious, bad behavior, not arbitrary, and sometimes Bezin, maybe we'll come back to it a little bit later, we'll take a step further. And by the way, that's exactly what the Devrei Chaim says. He says, after he rules against the Avi Yosef, he says, V'chol hanala halacha. All of the aforementioned discussion is referring to halacha. But lemigdar milsa, if there are problems, there are massive problems in these type of areas, then it's within the purview of Bezdin, right, to litigate or to stop somebody. So let me give you an example that happened. How am I going to do this? Okay, let's imagine for a moment that there was an existing summer camp somewhere in Florida. Not in Hollywood, so don't even start trying to figure that one out. I get a call, both very serious B'nai Torah, that the second fellow wants to open up a camp, and the first one says, listen, there's simply not enough people to sustain 2 camps. That was their argument. And the other guy says, well, this is a growing community. It's very easy to pool from the newcomers in order to satisfy both of our needs. And they said, it's true physically, in terms of what we call kamus, there's enough quantity of people, but this is a very firm camp, and we would have to start pooling from people that might compromise the ruchnius, the spirituality of the camp, okay? And again, I looked at it, we're talking about an extensive difference. We're not talking about one guy wears a gartel, one guy doesn't. We're talking about there was two wide ends of the spectrum on this thing. So, now all of a sudden we're outside of what we call strict legal considerations. Now I'll tell you something very interesting, and you as lawyers will find this mind-blowing. There's a Drashas Haran, Siman Yud Aleph, very worthwhile to go through it. Art Scroll is translated the Drashas Haran. He says, Choshen Mishpat and most halachas is not utilitarian. There's no utility to it. That's not the purpose. It brings a good raya. Think about it for a moment. To be killed for capital punishment for murder, you have to have 2 witnesses that have to warn you, and the warning has to be accurate, and you have to kill the guy within a very short period of time. If they do the warning properly, and you just count to 4 Mississippi instead of 3 Mississippi, Bezdin cannot convict you. Now, obviously, that could lead to a big problem. And so he says that as a result of that, in order that there shouldn't be a murder and things of that nature become commonplace, it was left to the province of the Melech to enact certain things in an extra legal or meta-halachic sense, whatever, not considering the Red protocols halacha, and people could meet the maker outside of the strict structure, and not only in the area of that, but in all areas. The Melech had that power. We don't have a Melech, but in Siman Beis and Hilchos Dayanim, this is somewhat relegated to a degree to the Dayanim. Again, we can't be lording over people. It has to be done with tremendous consideration and deliberation. And by the way, I will tell you something, just so you know. I literally lose sleep before we have to rule on something, and even if it's a small amount of money. I told my colleagues, the minute we stop losing sleep is when we have to stop. It's a very awesome responsibility, and we don't take it lightly. So over here, I felt that this was a legitimate consideration, and I called somebody that doesn't paskin, someone I subscribe to, a Rebbe, does not rule the Avi Yosef. I explained to him my argument that here it's a communal consideration. He agreed with me. He would rule the same way. But I told the fellows, look, that's just for 1 year, because it was already like April, right? By next year already, I don't think the Elefitha can be stopped. You need to get busy and figure out how you're going to, I can't play God, so to speak. But I did tell the party that has the camp that they have to reimburse the second guy, User Moshe, for any expenses that he incurred in his endeavor. So that gives you a little example of the subtleties of how you have to come out of rulings. Anyhow, so that's competition. Again, every case has to be considered very carefully, and if there's regular problems and abuse, then sometimes Bezin will stop somebody even though they're not poskening the obvious. Now, you had a question?
Yeah, in terms of glittering competition, so there's with AI now, the goal of much of AI is to destroy industries and reputable.
They have a concerted goal. They have
many times to disrupt an industry. That is the goal. To change it.
Okay, no. So if somebody sets up competition with ruinous price cutting, things of that nature, then you stop them. There was a case. I'll tell you a very fascinating case. The Maram Padwa, one of the great Gedolim, he published a Rambam. Now, if you know, in the late 1400s, 1492, I think it was, the Gutenberg Bible came out, and then printing became, for Jews, I think, disproportionately used the printing press, because now all of a sudden, because manuscripts were lost. So he printed a Rambam, and there were competing Italian printers that wanted his business. He gave it to one particular one, and the other guy was furious. He decided he's going to print the Rambam cheaply and drive him right out of business. What we call a sure Rambam, right? The Ramah Paskin and Siman Yud, for many different reasons, that they have to put him in cherem, that nobody could buy this particular sefer. By the way, I should have mentioned, the Ramah himself, there's contradictions all over with the Ramah, whether he holds the Av Yosef or not, but we'll leave that aside. And one other piece to this I just want to add, which I neglected to mention earlier, there's a machlokes whether Yoel M'Chaber is a Doraisa or it's the Rabbanan. The Yisrael says it's the Rabbanan because you see they make exceptions. If it was Doraisa, you couldn't make exceptions. But the Chassam Sofer explains no. He says it's like a hybrid. In other words, Chazal there's a pasuk Som Shamlei Choik that the Rabbanim Chazal were given over from the Torah the rights and the obligation to institute laws that will ensure social harmony. And once they make that decision, it actually rises to the level of Doraisa. You find this in Chol Hamoed, by the Malachas of Chol Hamoed. According to one opinion, it was up to the Rabbanim to decide what will interfere with someone's Simchas Yantif and what won't. And once they say this law is prohibited, or this Malach is prohibited, it becomes an Isser Doraisa. It's like a hybrid of some sort. So just also to keep, so that's what the Chassam Sofer says, that this actually is a Din Doraisa. Yes?
What if you're a supplier that can supply the product for cheaper? So you're saying...
Okay, good question. Okay. So the Rimagash, I neglected to mention, thank you for asking the question. Rimagash holds that the group benefit trumps, if I may use that word, the individual rights. And that means if there's a savings to the group, or let's say there's a qualitative difference, then you can't stop somebody even according to, and nobody can be stopped, because people, you don't want it to have that at the expense of the customers. Now, there is a discussion whether he means a substantial difference in price, a small difference in price, but by and large, the group's benefits supersede the individual benefit. So yes, but again, it can't be ruinous price cutting. You have a better product, you have a cheaper product, that can't be stopped. And by the way, you should know something very interesting, just Havdil, they've done studies. Competition generally not only helps the customers, it also helps the producers. There's a famous story with Rockefeller. They broke up the Seven Sisters, right? He had a monopoly on the oil, and they were going to go public with 7 companies. So he said to his friends, buy Standard Oil, because he knew it was going to go up. They've done studies. I think there was a study where there was a Starbucks and no competing coffee shop. They opened another one, and they both did more business. So you'll find frequently that industries like electronics in cities, they'll congregate in one area, like in New York, the Diamond District, or this or that, because the sum total is greater. A person's going to go to an area with as many shops, so they figure even though there's a lot of competition, but the end result will be he'll end up buying. They all do more business. That's just a side point. Okay, so.
Case of one of the rise competition is from Maral, the circus Kaddish.
The Chasam Sofer.
Chasam Sofer.
Maharil.
Yeah. Make a chilik that by Kaddish you could argue what are you taking away from another person. It's true that halacha kashtech see one person, right now really taking away something, maybe it's on you to go ahead and do kilo say twice.
Because Chasam Sofer explains what's the whole tachlis of Kaddish. That you're saying Yehei Shmei Rabbah, you're being guided in the tzibur to say Yehei Shmei Rabbah, and that's the schus for the nifter. So
you say to get another person.
No, he holds a schedule Kaddish. I don't want to. There's a whole discussion, but he himself makes that extrapolation. Not David Shalom. He made that extrapolation.
Well, what's the start for someone paying taxes, and why doesn't it apply today with municipal?
Well, what's this for someone paying taxes?
No, why is that?
What does that mean?
Why does that give you the right? Why does that give you the right?
It's not Chavrusa.
And why is it?
Good that we're doing Klish and Mishpat. No, yeah, remember we have to do Dina Malchus Dina one time. No. So the answer is that he's part of the city. Then he's taking on responsibility because
municipalities, roads, police.
No. So he's. You might ask what tax, but whatever it is that constitutes that tax, he is now accepting responsibility. He has the commensurate rights.
Why today does it not apply strongly? Just because?
No, I said it does apply today, and therefore the guy won't be viewed as someone from outside the city. I agree with you.
And if someone from out of town.
And by the way, it's a shaykh cargo. Doesn't mean he pays the cargo.
Sure. And if
Yeah.
the guy from out of town is there first.
Huh?
If the guy from out of town is there first, is there any issue with the guy from in town?
Oh, that's it. No, probably not. He has a pazarka. Probably.
The guy from in town's not open yet.
Yeah, I don't think he could. I don't
There's
think
no
so.
competition.
Yeah, and it's not even so relevant anyhow. Let me just get to the last one. Sorry, Marufia. So that is talking about the following. There are two tshuvas when it comes to Marufia. It's brought in Kufman Vav. Everything I told you is in Hilchos Shkenim with the exception of Oni Mahapich B'Charora, because that's not geographical based. That's a different situation. So it seems that in the old days, again, remember, Jews, particularly in Europe, I don't know about the Sephardic country, were very, very limited in the forms of occupation that they could do. That's why we got so good at finance, and really there was finance and bars, and we had Mechiras Chametz and Heteriska. Okay, just not that they work. It's halachically serious matter. That's a discussion. Ribbis, we should put that on the agenda. Ribbis is a big issue. Anyhow. So just like they had a Shabbos guy, so to speak, a Shabbos non-Jew, they also had a Ribbis non-Jew. People, they were lending to that. This was my guy. This is the guy I'm charging Ribbis to. So he says some places they rule Marufia. What Marufia means, either it's known that this was this person's customer, he has regularity. And so he said in some towns they stop people from interfering with Marufia, taking away somebody's customer, and some towns they don't. Okay? Donin ve'ein donin. That's tshuva number one. Tshuva number two is the Rashba. The Rashba speaks about it as somebody, it's a tailor that had regular customer, and someone's trying to interfere and take it away. So the Rashba felt, he brought two rayas to this. And basically, he says like this: if the guy has a genuine, reasonable expectation to keep this customer, in the absence of any interference, he's not going to leave him. You can't interfere. He calls it. He uses the makire kahuna. Makire kahuna is in Hilchos Yarshim, the Nachla. A bechor gets a double portion, but it's only if something that's under the domain of the father at the time of his passing, not owed money, for example, right? Because we know loans are certainly not under the domain of the lender. You're lucky if you get the money back. So Makir Kuna is that he had a kohen that the father was a kohen, and his kohen would give him regularly his portion. And since he had every reasonable expectation that he wants the Bechor would get a double portion of that. So he says here too, that reasonable expectation is tantamount to almost him getting it in his hands. Okay? So, but he says you can stop him, but you can't go back retroactively on the damage that he did. And it gets a little bit confusing in the Shulchan Aruch, because the Ramah brings four situations. The Mordechai just says donin vein donin, and the Ramah says donin vein donin, v'yesh matir and v'yesh aiser. I'm not going to get into the whole thing now, but by and large, with the exception of one opinion, it's either actionable or not actionable, or at least prohibited. And one opinion says it's okay, it's mutter. Okay? Halacha l'maisa, again, we run into the same problem. It's very hard to enforce this in Besdin. But if something is done that is inappropriate behavior, insidious, then Bezin will act. So I'll give you a case with the Minchas Yitzchak. Again, I'm sorry we don't really have adequate time to really deal with these things at the proper depth they deserve. So Minchas Yitzchak had a case where there was a fellow that was working. So let me see. So, yeah. Ruvain was acquiring goods from Shimon, and Ruvain hired Levi to be his salesman. And so Levi's going around, and you can guess what happened next. Levi decides he's going to go to Shimon directly. Sell to me, we'll circumvent this guy, and we'll both make more money, right? Maisim Shabachol Yoim. So Minchas Yitzchak, it's Marufia, be something else. Not so hard, not easy to enforce, but he felt because this was such an avlo, this was such a disgrace, he prohibited the salesman from approaching the seller for 4 or 5 years. Okay, so there are instances where Bezdin will deliberate and depending on the situation, will act in accordance. So it does happen. It does happen. But again, just because something is not actionable, people need to understand that you have to act appropriately, and Kadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, and your parnasa is not going to be diminished. Again, it's not easy. He just showed me now a beautiful story where there were 2 fish markets right next to each other. One had a fire. I assume it was a real fire, right? Not Jewish lightning. And so the other fellow invited the one that lost it to come into his place and conduct his business there. That's a madrega. That's a madrega. It's not easy to ask everybody that, but it's, again, I just want to introduce it. It's really a very superficial treatment of the topic. Okay, it's very involved, but hashkafically, we have to be sensitive to our brethren, and if somebody does compete, the Chazon Ish speaks about this in Emunah B'Tachan. A guy says he's a big Baal B'Tachan, and somebody opens up a competing shop, and he goes crazy, does everything he can to stop him from going into business. That's not B'Tachan. Obviously, Kadosh Baruch Hu runs the show. So there's a balance here, and generally speaking, not always, competition is healthy. Now, I didn't really get into non-compete agreements. That's kind of a side issue. It's complicated. Legally, it's hard to apply. Halachically, it's hard to apply. That's also part of this, going after people's employees. I had a case when I was in South Africa. They asked me about, that this was going on. What could he do about it? And by the way, I forgot to mention, most people hold that Marufi is only relevant when the customer is a non-Jew, because they'll go with the flow. But the 3DH says no. A Jew never wants to be subordinated anyhow. If he can get a better deal, he'll move too. So there's no smichas das, there's no real, that's what the CDH says, okay? Just something to consider. So there's a lot here that we haven't discussed. I apologize, it's rather limited. But I guess let me take questions now before, okay, thank you.
What do you mean by based in enforcing? What power does Basin have to really?
So you're asking in general, how does it?
Like if someone you need to litigate that they don't open, you just.
So let's take the more basic question. How does Bezdin work? That's by the way, an important shear. Again, you guys are lawyers, to be very careful about these things. Going to secular courts is a serious infraction, with some exception. I mean, amongst Jews. The way we work, because we are living in the United States of America, we are not living in a country where we have that type of power. So we're functioning as an arbitration panel. And so what we do is, anybody that comes to Bezdin has to sign an arbitration agreement that is written by a competent, hopefully, lawyer, that it's binding in the state of Florida. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. If you lose a Bezdin, you can say, okay, sue me in court. So generally speaking, it's simply an enforcement issue. Now, there are exceptions where the judge will vacate a judgment, which I'm not going to get into those exceptions now, but by and large, we've had it pretty lucky about that. So if we have a ruling, we did have a ruling with restaurants, and we didn't stop the guy, but one of the other guys was selling to the schools. We said for 5 years you can't approach the schools. We wrote that in. So if there's a problem, then we'd have to figure out, you'd have to enforce it. There might be monetary concessions we'd have to add on to it. It's complicated. We've had issues where we try to bifurcate a judgment, and the judges can't handle that. They can't handle the two-step thing. So that's how it would basically work. We don't I once had a lady that called me, she says, Rabbi, this guy's acting so-and-so, you need to do something, make a declaration. I said, Madam, I adjudicate monetary affairs. I'm not the head of the city. And so she said, okay, I'm going to call Shmuel Kamenetsky. Okay, so she calls, and she calls me back. I said, no. He said, you're right. Good. So that's hopefully answers some of your questions. And maybe we should turn this off, because if I get too extemporaneous, there's going to be a real big problem. That's why I don't like to record these things. But anyhow.
If there was a clause that you just signed ahead of time.
Okay, shkoyach. Any other questions?